Okay, good morning again. So this morning we're gonna run pretty quickly through the rest of Ignatius's story, and then come back to an event that was taking place at the same time that he's in Manresa, um, and that is this German Inquisition. There was a Spanish Inquisition and a German Inquisition, and the Germans are going after Martin Luther, who was protesting aspects of the Catholic Church. And don't you know, not much later than that, Ignatius goes through the Spanish Inquisition. And so right away, uh, I'm so obsessed with my immediate past and immediate future that I'm not really much of a historian, but I'm finding this stuff fascinating, and the challenge is to draw parallels and contrasts between what Martin Luther and what Ignatius are going through with what we go through in our own spiritual journey and our own battle within, as we seek to uh, build a relationship with God and ask for the power to do God's will for us, which is really heady stuff. We don't talk about it a lot in AA meetings, and that's fine, because the purpose of an AA meeting is to stay sober and help another alcoholic achieve sobriety. But if you're into the steps, the purpose is coming to a spiritual awakening so you can practice principles and carry a message and practice principles. And of course, there's always great debate about what is the message that we're trying to carry. And the answer I like the most is on page 164, that you cannot transmit something you haven't got. You see to it that your relationship with your conception of higher power is working, and you're going to have a great life. Um, and people around you too. This is the great fact for us, it says. Great fact is capitalized. Well, to me, that's a message. And then it tells us how to do it. Abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to God and to your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find and join us. So, any rate, uh, what we're going to be talking about is the struggle that Ignatius is going through, and the struggle that Martin Luther went through, and relate it to the struggle that each of us goes through as we are trying to build this relationship. Um, so I'm first going to wind up with Ignatius's story, the rest of the story. What we've done so far, we've talked about his life before his wounding, about his period of convalescence where he was reading spiritual books and fantasizing about worldly exploits. His primary purpose was to gain worldly renown, um, but he starts realizing that after obsessing about how he's going to win the heart of some special lady, um, he feels good, but it goes away. But when he's reading the lives of the saints and thinking about it, well, if they can do it, I can do it, and really changing his whole approach to his life, he feels good and it lasts longer. And he starts forming this idea of desolation and consolation. And I have to put a different spin on it. He's good and evil because that's the way the church is talking. For me, it's spiritual versus human. And I'm convinced, at least for me, my human nature wants self preservation, self gratification, and self justification. And my soul doesn't care about any of that stuff. What my soul wants is to live out its purpose on earth. And Ignatius is saying, all the things that most of us human beings are concerned about don't really matter. They're incidentals. Doesn't matter if your life is long or short, rich or poor, healthy or sick, honored or dishonored. That's the amazing one that he puts at the end, because he's gone from wanting to be honored with worldly renown to really seeking humiliation, a humble approach to things. He thinks that's a good opportunity to get closer to God. So it's fascinating for me. What I love, I'm so glad you all show up, because I do a lot of work trying to get this stuff in perspective, and trying to relate it to our AA stuff. And just before going into the rest of Ignatius's life, I've just been having several conversations with other alcoholics about how, the real challenge in our lives, I believe, is self-centered fear. And and I'm trying to train myself to understand. I first learned this in resentment. You feel a resentment, you move it through the columns, and you realize that some aspect of yourself, your pride, your ambitions, your self esteem, your personal relations, including sex, your financial relations, your sense of safety, some part of that manifestation of a human self is hurt or threatened. That means fear. And then we get over into that fourth column, and we're asking ourselves, with regard to that person in column one, or situation in column one, where am I selfish, dishonest, or frightened? We're trying to get to the fear, because if we can get to the fear, then we can train ourselves to know what to do. And what we're trained to do is pray at once for removal, which we do by sharing it with somebody and by making amends if called for. And then the second part of the fear prayer is asking for redirection. God, please remove my fear of fill in the blank, because the more specific you are about the fear, the more specific a result you're going to get from the prayer. Um, so please remove my fear and direct my attention to what you would have me be. And what you would have me be for me is patient, tolerant, kind, and loving, the exact opposite of impatient, judgmental, selfish, and frightened, which is way I come into this thing. So I don't want to lose my train of thought. So and then of course yeah, I got it. But so there are at least three levels of dishonesty in a resentment. In order for me to maintain a resentment, three levels of dishonesty. First lie I tell myself is, I am unhappy because of your behavior, and it's not my fault. If you would behave better, I could be happy. Um, Second lie is, here's a good idea. I'm going to resent you. And when you feel my resentment, you are going to ask yourself naturally why. And you are going to look at your behavior. You're going to see what you are doing that's making me miserable. And you're going to change. And then you'll be a better person. I'll be able to be happy. The world will be a better place, all because of the positive power of resentment. When you get over this, you realize what a lie that is, that it's not the truth. But when you're in the middle of it, seems reasonable to me. And the third lie, of course, is the one that's the most challenging. I am not capable of treating another person the way you're treating me. And that's what gives me the right to ask you to be different. Usually we find out it may not be with that same person, it may be an entirely different situation, but we have done to another what that person has done to us. So, what I learned from resentment was, it's not about justified anger, it's about fear. And then, if I can go to fear, is always about lack of power. And what I lack power over is me. I can't not react the way I'm reacting when something out there does something, I get frightened within and it turns into resentment, and I can't not do that. I don't have the power. The beginning of we agnostics. We can wish to be moral, we can wish to be philosophically comforted, we can try as hard as we want, and we can't pull it off. Lack of power is our dilemma. And if lack of power is our dilemma, then getting power is the solution. But we've already admitted in A and B and C that human power is not going to cut it. Human power is not going to do the deal. What's human power? Anything of the mind or the body, physical or mental. It's not going to do the deal. I need spiritual power. And then when we look at this life of Ignatius and we look at Luther, we will see similar things in the way, and they get their power through a relationship with their conception of God. Sorry for my phone dinging. Um, so, uh, so um, next Sunday, I get the opportunity to deliver a sermon, if you can imagine that, at an Episcopal church nearby. And so I'm just deep into how do I, and my job is bringing Alcoholics Anonymous inside an Episcopal church, and because it's where we have our meetings. 200 alcoholics walk through the doors of this church on a weekly basis, and the ministers thinks it would be a good idea if the congregants knew more about us. Um, so I just been thinking a lot, and especially when you get into Ignatius and you get into Luther, and the real different approaches that they made to their church, as well as to their, what this thing I'm going to read to you calls the war within, the inner battle, that I believe takes place in all of us. It may be intense, it may be more gradual, but there is a struggle within, I believe, between my human nature and my spiritual nature. And my human nature wants to run my life, and it's not happy when I'm paying more attention to my spiritual nature than I am to it. And like a little spoiled brat, it starts calling for my attention. And in my case, the way it called for my attention was a deep relapse on self-pity. I just went down. I went down hard. I went down for a long time. And I'm so grateful for that today, because that's when I experienced powerlessness over me. Nobody wants to, I don't believe that we want to be in resentment or anger or fear or remorse. We don't want to feel bad about ourselves. But I lacked power over that. And I really learned powerlessness, and I really learned how hard I need to work on a daily basis to get that power back. Okay, so we're going to finish up with Ignatius's story, and so if you'll remember, he's got this knightly life going on for 30 years. He gets wounded in this useless battle, had no business being in this battle. His legs get shattered. He's laying in the castle. He asks for books, and he wants chivalrous romance novels, and he winds up with the lives of the saints and the life of Jesus, and goes through this conversion experience. And then he forms in his mind, what I'm going to do? I'm going to do a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. I want to go to the Holy Land. I want to see where this guy went through this stuff 1,500 years ago. And it's interesting how much a pilgrimage is a part of different spiritual traditions. So another thing, you may know this already, but according to some studies, about a third of the world identifies themselves as Christian. A quarter of the world identifies themselves as Muslim. And then it starts dropping. There's Hindus and Buddhists. And then there are atheists. They say that 15% do not identify with any specific religion, and then there are what they call folk religions. Very interesting. Within the Christian, well, and part of the Muslim thing, part of their way of spiritual training is you take a pilgrimage. You take a pilgrimage to Mecca, and Christians may want to go to the Holy Land, or there's that El Camino, the pathway in Spain, where people are going from one part to another part, and it's a difficult journey, and it's really a model of the difficulties of the spiritual journey. It's difficult physically, but that means it's also difficult mentally, and that means it's also, yeah, a spiritual aspect will be involved. So I'm just trying to say that Ignatius's focus on a pilgrimage is something that is part of traditional theological teachings. We go to Akron. We, not all of us, but I've been there. I've seen the room where Bill and Dr. Bob met. A teeny little room in a teeny little building next to a great big, fabulous industrialist estate in Akron, Ohio, and I saw the Mayfair Hotel, didn't go into the lobby, um, and I saw the hospital where Dr. Bob and Sister Ignatia were working. But it was something. It was just good to see. You've got these ideas, and that's what a pilgrimage maybe can do. I don't know. So Ignatius has left the castle. He walks with a limp, one leg shorter than the other. He switches out his fabulous clothing for a tunic made out of sackcloth, has a staff and a begging bowl, and he starts wandering. His goal is Barcelona, and he's going to go from Barcelona to Venice, and then from Venice to Jerusalem. Um, and he gets waylaid in Manresa for I think it's a year, close to a year, and he goes through this. What we talked about last time was this deep enlightenment experience on the banks of the river Cardoner, and it's really a beautiful description. That even though he doesn't say much, he doesn't write this autobiography till he's 3 years before he dies, and he dictates it, and it's pretty dry. It's not, yet it's important to read stuff around it to flesh it out or make it more with feeling. But so he has this enlightenment experience. He eventually gets to Barcelona, then gets to Venice, then gets to Jerusalem. He's turned back. His plan is going to stay there the rest of his life and help souls. That's the other thing that shows up early for Ignatius, is his desire to help souls grow in their experience. And from AA, the importance that we place on trying to be helpful to somebody new, or even somebody who's been around a long time. That help Being of service to other people is a vital and important component of our work. And I'm just going to say, because I'm just going to say it, you know, people will say you got to give it away to keep it. Well, that's fine, but in my mind, 10, 11, and 12 are not maintenance steps. I'm not trying to keep anything. I am trying to improve my conscious contact and act on the results of that. So I'm one of the ones that's going to say, you got to give it away if you want to really get it, because nothing has helped me more in my understanding of what's happened to my life and how different my life is today than talking to another alcoholic on the deepest level that I'm able to talk with them about their relationship with their higher power and how to bring that forward into their life. So, okay, so he wants to stay in Jerusalem. They turn him back. Um, he comes back and first to Barcelona and then winds up in Alcala, a Spanish town, and then Salamanca, another Spanish town. That have these educational institutions. What happens to him, and he gets inquisitions 3 times, where he's imprisoned twice, imprisoned once for 22 days, once for 42 days. Can you imagine? I mean, this is a simple, humble man only doing good, and he gets imprisoned because they accuse him of teaching without a degree. The would we ever do that in AA? We don't even have a degree. You don't get anything. And so in his mind, he wants to help souls, and in contrast to Luther, he's not fighting the church. He loves the church in his own way. And so he goes through this educational process, which is the middle part of his story, him getting educated, and he winds up in Paris, and that's where he starts building the early Jesuits. There were 6 other people significantly younger than he was. We'll be talking about him eventually, I suppose, but so that he's in Paris for 6 years, and then he winds up going to Rome, and he spends the rest of his life in Rome, and it's in Rome that he dictates that autobiography. So what we're going to focus on now is this. I've got a reading here. That comes from this book, and I'm not telling you to get it. I'm just identifying where this comes from, Alone and on Foot. And this is a Jesuit author. His name is Brian Grogan. He's around today, and he's distilled another work that is uh, uh, instead of being a little skimpy autobiography, it's 700 pages. It's this big, lengthy thing where some historical researcher has documented all these things about Ignatius and all that he's done. So, and I'm convinced that this author of this book is an alcoholic because he just slips it in there when he's telling the story. He just slips in these little things. I think in this thing that I'm going to read you, one of the sections is called Faith and Works. You don't do that. I don't think you do that if you haven't read that 3 times in the big book. Faith without works is dead. And he says just these other little things that lead me to believe that this guy has a good understanding of our fellowship and the work that we're doing. Okay, so and the other interesting thing uh, to me is that at the very time that he's going through this spiritual experience in Manresa on the banks of the Cardoner, I don't know how you say it, but um, Martin Luther is going through the Diet of Worms. Now, I put that in there hoping that somebody's going to read that email and go, the Diet of Worms? What the hell are they talking about? Because I didn't know. I mean, I've heard of it, but I didn't know. And out of the Diet of Worms comes the Edict of Worms. And in the Edict of Worms, basically, poor old Martin Luther gets excommunicated, declared a heretic, and gets walled up in this prison tower for maybe 10 years. I don't know. Um, and so it's also interesting to see what is Martin Luther's beef. Um, and it'll show up a little bit in this reading, but just to be more specific, uh, I had no idea. I think I told you a third of the world identifies itself as Christian. Well, half of that third identifies itself as Catholic. Half of the people that consider themselves Christian identify as Catholic. A quarter consider themselves Protestant. So that's a significant number. And Protestant comes from protest. Martin Luther was protesting different activities of the Catholic Church. And what it really comes down to, I I think, is that we have this tradition in AA that we're not going to have any professional class. We're not going to have anybody paid to do the stuff that we do, and we're not going to have them educated in some sort of way and give them some sort of license or certificate of completion or something that they could hold over anybody else. We're all on the same level, and we're all doing this for free and for fun, says Chuck Chamberlain in A New Pair of Glasses. There is no professional class. Well, one of Martin Luther's things is you're trying to insinuate yourself between the person and God. You're saying that the only way you can be forgiven is by the declaration of a certified priest or parent, but somebody within the church. And they had these things called indulgences, and they had these all kinds of stuff that's where the church is in between you and God. And obviously that doesn't, in AA there is nothing between you and God. This is about your relationship with your conception of higher power, and nothing else. And so I find that fascinating. And he also protested the papacy, that the Pope had these divine powers that he felt that's not spiritual truth. None of us, we're all children of God, and we have that direct relationship, and we're not going to give another human being divine power over the rest of us. And it has to do, they use the word authority a lot. He was saying, the scriptures are our authority, the way we say the big book is our authority, not the words of any particular human being. So, and they call these the five solas, SOLA, which means alone. And I can't run through them now, but it's that we alone have this relationship with our higher power. It is God's grace alone that redeems us. It's not another human being that redeems us. And that's like us saying, sponsor's not going to keep you sober. Sponsor's not going to forgive you for whatever you have been going through. This happens between you and God, and it's an act of grace. So the opposite of lack of power is receiving grace. Something happens by grace and by grace alone. And I think one of the beautiful things I love about Ignatius is that service becomes such an important part um, of the whole Jesuit mentality. You'll remember we've got a triangle, an equilateral triangle inside a circle. One side is the unity of the fellowship. One side is the importance of one-on-one relationships where we're together one-on-one in the steps, in the book. And one side of that triangle is service, where we're trying to think about something or somebody other than our selfish, self-centered selves, and trying to be of service. And the whole thing is in this circle, and the circle is prayer and meditation. And the circle makes the triangle stable, and it makes the triangle happen. That prayer and meditation is and why, in at least in this interpretation of the steps, we do 1 through 9 to get to doing 10, 11, and 12 all the time. And when you run through the 10-step protocol, you're going to see that it involves steps 4 through 9. They're little pieces of 4 through 9 right smack in the middle of the 10-step. Pray at once for removal, share with somebody, make amends if called for, turn your mind to service. And then at the end of that, it's asking the question, how can I best serve thee? Thy will, not mine, be done. This is what we're supposed to be thinking about all day long. None of us do it, of course, but I'll tell you, it's a quick way to remind yourself. My mind is hung up on the traffic jam that I'm in. I'm not gonna be late for whatever. um, can I remember to turn my mind to God? How can I best serve you? Right here in the middle of, I'm having trouble in some relationship. God, how can I best serve you? Right in the middle of that. Okay, I got to get going here. So this is chapter 15 of about 70 chapters in this book, Alone and on Foot. Um, and I think most of these words are the words of Brian Grogan, S.J. I'm pretty sure, he's Irish, and okay. Chapter 15. The first paragraph is entitled "The War Within." At this stage of his life, now this is Ignatius is a pilgrim now, an anonymous pilgrim. Um, in Manresa on his way to Barcelona. At this stage of his life, Ignatius took no part in the affairs of his family, of his country, of the papacy, or of the wider political scene. Then it talks about stuff that was going on at the same time. There's a war between Spain and France. There's a conquest of Mexico by Cortez. There's somebody goes circumnavigates the globe. The Muslims are sacking Belgrade and Rhodes. It just blows my mind. The religious wars, damage and destruction fought in the name of the church. Um, Such events meant nothing to him except insofar as they might affect his travel plans for Jerusalem. Made no claims to the times in which he was living. They were not his. He was in the throes of a personal crisis, and he had an insatiable thirst for the absolute. That's quite a statement, do I have an insatiable thirst for the absolute? I don't know that I do. I have an insatiable thirst to pray only for knowledge of God's will for me and the power to carry that out. That I can say I do have. That's what's in my mind. What do you want me? What do you want me to do here in my remaining days on planet Earth? And then give me the power to carry it, because I am convinced from my experience. Once I get confirmation that my higher power wants me moving in a certain direction, then I can claim the focus, the energy, the power to carry that out. Um, New editions of the Bible, the writings of these different people, including Thomas More, passed him by. He was instead satisfied with this notebook. He's got this little notebook full of excerpts, and he starts writing the spiritual exercises in this little notebook. Um, he was instead satisfied with his notebook containing his excerpts from the life of Christ and the flower of the saints. He would deal with people of influence only to request a passport to the Holy Land. So I love thinking about how different, there are no phones, there are no computers, there's no electricity going around. I mean, it's amazing to think back to I didn't get time to look up the Dark Ages. And in retrospect, we call this the Dark Ages. What's that mean? And then the Renaissance comes on after that. Any rate, then this next section is called Luther. Not even Martin Luther was present in Ignatius's world. Luther, condemned and excommunicated, appeared before the Diet of Worms and then was walled up in Wartburg Castle at the same time that Ignatius was recuperating from his wounds and reevaluating his life at Loyola. I, I just find that fascinating that's true. Luther was responsible for the tremendous upheaval that was devastating the European world at the time when Ignatius was beginning his pilgrimage. But the idea of himself being an antagonist to Luther, so some people are going to claim Ignatius was part of what they called the Counter Reformation. Luther is the Reformation of all this Catholic stuff. So there were people that were working against the Reformation. Um, The idea of himself being an antagonist to Luther or organizer of anti-Protestant fighting throughout Europe or becoming a knight for the Catholic Reformation never crossed his mind. And he says, of our anonymous pilgrim. Now, why is he calling him an anonymous pilgrim if he's not also involved with AA? Ignatius had made a vow of chastity freely and spontaneously at the very time when Luther was mocking the tyranny of religious vows, which Luther considered unnatural and contrary to the gospel. That's an interesting statement of what Luther was fighting. Ignatius was simply Ignatius, an unknown pilgrim, whereas the name of Luther was resounding throughout Europe. This next section is called Reform of Church or Self. Luther was almost 10 years older than Ignatius, already well advanced along the road he had chosen. Ignatius was just beginning his journey, dressed in sackcloth, plodding along the road with one sandal on and one sandal off. Luther attacked the church head on, lashed out mercilessly against it, separated himself from it, all in the name of the gospel. So Luther is claiming he's acting on the gospel, not on the Pope. Ignatius did not go out to reform the church. He sought to reform himself from within. That's what we're doing, ladies and gentlemen. We are reforming ourselves from within by working our way through the steps because we've recognized lack of power as our dilemma, and we're trying to get that power so that we can carry a message and practice our principles. Ignatius was a quiet man, a master of the soft, serious word whispered in the ear at the opportune time. He did not judge. It is possible that he did not even have time to think about the church. He realized that everything could and should be good and that the bad comes from our misguided choices. I love that. Misguided. I more and more, I can see people's behavior and absolutely my own as misguided. It's not evil. It's just misguided. I'm listening to the wrong voice within. I'm listening to the voice of my ego, my human self, not the voice of my spirit, my soul. He realized that everything could and should be good, and that the bad times come from our misguided choices. For him, the church was like a sheltering roof overhead, or a lap as snug as the lap of a mother, or like the air one breathes without asking at each moment whether it is polluted or not. Similarities. Then he's going to talk about similarities between these two guys. Um, Both Martin Luther and Ignatius were reclusive heroes. Both were passionate. Each was seduced and conquered. That's interesting phrases by an intense inner experience. You can say this, you could say all this stuff about Bill Wilson, that he was a passionate man and that his spiritual experience in Towns Hospital and shortly thereafter drove the rest of his life. And that's going to be true with Ignatius. His enlightenment on the banks of the Cardoner drove the rest of his life. And don't ever forget, if you're wondering, well, when am I going to get one of these lights out spiritual experiences? That the spiritual appendix is very clear. For most of us, it is not a lights out experience. It happens very gradually. Other people usually see it before we see it. Each was seduced by an intense inner experience, one in his monastery, the other in his Manresa cell. Their interior worlds were sufficiently seductive and obsessive to absorb all their energies at every moment of the day and night. That's another thing so we have so many distractions. We're not thinking about this stuff day and night. Most of us aren't anyway. And then get this, because this is going to talk about personal experience, which is so important in AA. This is all based on our personal experience. The personal experience of each had more power than any kind of theoretical knowledge. And it was from their experience that they hammered out their respective beliefs. They both had a certain sense of the poetic. They were honest as opposed to deceitful, generous as opposed to manipulative. Each had an experience of sin and self-loathing. This is this is wonderful. One of my favorite lines. I shouldn't even say that because I got so many favorite lines, but it's going to be on page 77, and it's the very start of amends, and it says, at the moment we're trying to put our lives in order. We're trying to um, settle our self-loathing. Actually, I think we're trying to overcome our uh, disgust with our previous behavior. um, so Anyway, each had an experience of sin and self loathing that had shaken him to the core of his being, and this experience rendered both of them more open to a long awaited peace. That's another word for serenity. Uh, let's see, at a particular time in his life, Ignatius would have understood very well these words of Luther. So now this is Martin Luther. My rebellious flesh burns me with a devouring fire. I, who should be the prey of the spirit, am consumed by the flesh, by lust, by sloth, by idleness, by torpor. It's all the stuff we complain about. That we want to do this spiritual deal, but our minds are are caught up in the temptations of the flesh, if you will. Um, Luther was that solitary, lonely. Luther did not so desperately stand in the need of teaching, but of a spiritual life. What he needs is a spiritual life and inner peace, liberating certainty, rest in the Lord. And that's true for Ignatius as well. Last chapter, and then we're done. Faith and works. Each man transformed his way into a universal teaching because both of them were convinced that it is in the heart of the human person rather than in our institutions that the decisive battles are fought. We're in a resentment inventory where we express our resentment toward people, institutions, and principles. We haven't talked much about principles, but that's a deeply held self-concept. But you can imagine institutions have a life of their own, and by tradition, we are as least organized as possible. We are a fellowship. We are not an institution, and that's important. Uh, Luther will raise a hue and cry with the assistance of the printing press. Ignatius, in quiet corners, will meet face to face with his conversation partner. Um, it's just beautiful. Luther sees Christ as the Redeemer who gives us everything. Ignatius will not argue, but he will see that Christ asks something more from us than faith alone. Christ asks us to follow, imitate, and serve him so as to be able to offer him our will, even if it is a weak will. So I love this because he's saying right along in keeping with AA that we are trying to come to a spiritual awakening so that we can serve our fellow souls. Ignatius would always say he likes being helpful to souls. I just think that's kind of neat as opposed to human beings. Okay, so we're done for today. We're going to have some open discussion, and I'm going to bring this gong, and Robin's going to shut off the